When a mountain has a reputation for killing climbers, most people would call that impossible odds. But for those who have spent their careers conquering the impossible, even the deadliest peaks become just another challenge to overcome. Today, we're examining a surgeon who thought medical training could outsmart the world's deadliest mountain. It was May 15th, 2025, on Anapurna's treacherous south face, Nepal's 26,545-foot goddess of the harvest that rises like a deadly pyramid above the Marsyangdi Valley. Anapurna's deceptive beauty masks the most technically demanding and objectively dangerous climb among the world's 14 8,000-meter peaks. The south face is a vertical maze of hanging seracs, unstable ice walls, and avalanche-prone couloirs that have claimed 127 lives since first attempts began. Spring conditions in 2025 had been particularly unstable, with unusual temperature fluctuations creating dangerous ice formations throughout the upper reaches. Dr. Sebastian Cross was 39, a trauma surgeon from Seattle who had built his reputation on making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. His emergency room experience had taught him to assess critical situations rapidly, prioritize immediate threats, and trust his medical training over emotional responses. He had saved hundreds of lives by maintaining clinical objectivity when others panicked, analyzing symptoms methodically, and never accepting diagnoses without verifiable evidence. 4 years earlier, a climbing accident victim had arrived in Sebastian's emergency room with injuries that defied everything he thought he knew about trauma medicine. The 28-year-old alpinist had survived a 200-foot fall on Mount Baker with minimal external damage but catastrophic internal bleeding that Sebastian couldn't initially diagnose. The mountain had broken the man's body in ways that textbooks never described. The case obsessed Sebastian for weeks, driving him to understand how extreme environments could create medical scenarios that challenged even his extensive training, ultimately leading him to discover mountaineering as both a passion and what he believed was a logical extension of his medical expertise. Sebastian's transformation from weekend hiker to serious mountaineer had been methodical and expensive. He spent $40,000 on guided climbs across 3 continents, accumulating technical skills on Denali, Aconcagua, and Mont Blanc. His home gym resembled a medical laboratory crossed with a climbing wall, altitude simulation equipment, VO2 max testing apparatus, and detailed charts tracking his physiological responses to simulated high-altitude conditions. He approached each climb like a surgical procedure, with detailed protocols, backup plans, and contingency analyses that impressed even veteran guides. But his clinical mindset had also created a dangerous blind spot. Sebastian believed that if he couldn't measure or diagnose a risk, it didn't exist. The Anapurna expedition wasn't just another climb for Sebastian. It was his doctoral thesis in applied high-altitude medicine. He had spent 18 months preparing, not just physically, but intellectually, treating the mountain like a complex medical case that required comprehensive analysis. His research included forensic examination of every recorded fatality on the south face, detailed meteorological studies spanning 15 years, and physiological modeling of human performance at extreme altitude. His gear list read like a medical supply catalog, featuring pulse oximeters, portable ECG monitors, and emergency medications that most climbers had never heard of. Sebastian's confidence wasn't born from arrogance, but from genuine expertise. He understood the human body's response to altitude better than most doctors, and certainly better than most climbers. The fatal flaw in his approach was assuming that mountains operated according to the same logical principles as human physiology. Sebastian's expedition leader assigned him to work with Lakpa Sherpa, a decision that would prove tragically prophetic. At 45, Lakpa represented everything Sebastian's medical training had taught him to question: knowledge without documentation, expertise without credentials, and warnings based on intuition rather than data. Lakpa's family had been reading Anapurna's moods for 4 generations, with his grandfather among the first Sherpas to work on early Anapurna expeditions in the 1950s, and his father killed in a serac collapse on the south face in 1994. Lakpa himself had summited Anapurna 18 times and possessed an intuitive understanding of the mountain's dangerous patterns that couldn't be taught in medical school or measured with instruments. From the beginning, Sebastian treated Lakpa with professional courtesy, but maintained the analytical skepticism that had made him successful in medicine. He questioned Lakpa's assessments, asked for explanations of his reasoning, and cross-referenced everything against his own research. While respectful, Sebastian made it clear that he wouldn't accept advice without understanding the scientific basis behind it. On May 14th, Lakpa conducted his evening assessment at Camp 3, a precarious platform carved into the mountain's south face at 21,300 feet. Throughout the day, he had observed troubling signs that his years of experience had taught him to recognize. The ice formations above were making sounds, subtle creaking and groaning, that indicated structural instability. The wind patterns had shifted from the usual westerly flow to erratic gusts from multiple directions, a change that often preceded major serac collapses. Most concerning was what Lakpa called the mountain's breathing. Barely perceptible movements in the ice walls above that indicated the entire serac field was under stress. These movements were invisible to untrained eyes, but unmistakable to someone who had spent decades watching the mountain's moods. The ice was ready to fall, and when it did, the entire route would become a killing field. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The ice formations were making a sound Lakpa's father had taught him to fear, a deep, almost inaudible groaning that came from within the glacier itself as massive internal stresses built toward catastrophic release. The snow consistency had changed throughout the day, becoming granular and unstable in ways that indicated temperature fluctuations were weakening the structural bonds holding the seracs in place. Most telling was the absence of the usual icefall sounds from above. The mountain had gone eerily quiet, like a held breath before a scream. Lakpa had seen these exact conditions twice before in his 18 summits of Anapurna. Once in 2019, when he had successfully evacuated his team just hours before a massive serac collapse. And again in 2022, when he had ignored his instincts under client pressure and watched helplessly as the ice field above claimed 2 German climbers. The memory of those deaths haunted him, and he had sworn never again to guide clients into conditions that his generational knowledge warned against. But he also knew that Western climbers, especially those with professional credentials, rarely accepted Sherpa warnings without scientific justification, something the mountain's moods could never provide. That evening, Lakpa gathered the 6-person expedition team and delivered his assessment with characteristic directness. He insisted they needed to descend immediately because the serac field above was unstable. The ice was moving in ways that indicated imminent collapse, and the route would be impassable within hours. He explained that the wind patterns had shifted from the normal westerly flow to chaotic gusts from multiple directions, a change that always preceded major serac failures. The ice formations were singing with internal stress, making high-pitched sounds that meant the glacier was fracturing from within. Most critically, he could feel vibrations through the mountain itself, tremors that indicated the entire ice field was shifting as one massive, unstable unit ready to break free. Sebastian immediately began his medical analysis. He had been monitoring weather data throughout the day, and temperature readings showed stable conditions, with no significant warming that would destabilize ice formations. His understanding of ice mechanics suggested that structural failures required specific temperature and stress conditions that weren't present. He pulled out detailed meteorological data and ice stability research, none of which supported Lakpa's warnings. Lakpa tried to explain what he was observing, but Sebastian pressed him for specifics. He demanded measurable indicators of ice instability and scientific explanations for how ice movements could be detected without proper instruments. He wasn't being disrespectful, but his medical training had taught him that life or death decisions required verifiable data rather than subjective observations. Sebastian had seen too many emergency room cases where gut feelings led to misdiagnoses that cost lives, and his own meteorological equipment showed stable barometric pressure and temperature readings that contradicted Lakpa's warnings about imminent ice collapse. The remaining expedition members immediately sided with Lakpa's assessment. Their combined experience on multiple 8,000-meter peaks had taught them that Sherpa warnings carried more weight than weather forecasts or technical instruments. They had witnessed Too many close calls where traditional mountain knowledge had saved expeditions that modern equipment had deemed safe to continue. Sebastian acknowledged their concerns, but pointed out that his methodical approach had never failed him in 15 years of high-stakes decision-making. His emergency room experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure and trust systematic analysis over panic-driven reactions. He had successfully climbed 6 major peaks using the same data-driven methodology, and his medical background gave him unique insight into how altitude and stress could impair judgment, including the tendency to see threats that weren't actually present. Lakpa grew more insistent as he tried to make Sebastian understand what the mountain was telling him. The ice formations were singing, a high-pitched resonance that indicated structural failure was imminent. The wind had shifted from its normal pattern, creating pressure differentials that would destabilize the hanging seracs. Most alarming was the subtle vibration he could feel through his boots, tremors that meant the entire ice field was moving as one massive, unstable unit. Sebastian found himself genuinely torn between respect for Lakpa's obvious sincerity and his fundamental commitment to scientific methodology. But when he pulled out his seismometer app and detected no measurable ground movement, his confidence in the data solidified. Traditional knowledge, without technological validation, represented exactly the kind of unverified thinking that had been proven wrong countless times throughout medical history. His comprehensive ice climbing course in Alaska had taught him to trust measurable snowpack analysis over subjective environmental readings. When Lakpa not only refused to guide the team higher, but began physically blocking the route, Sebastian realized the situation had moved beyond professional disagreement into what he saw as irrational obstruction. He announced that anyone willing to follow evidence-based decision-making could continue with him as expedition leader. His medical training qualified him to monitor the team's physiological condition. His route study had been exhaustive, and his equipment could provide real-time safety data that superstition simply couldn't match. At 5 a.m. on May 15th, Sebastian led 3 other climbers away from Camp 3, his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as they climbed toward the serac field above. Lakpa made one final attempt to stop them, grabbing Sebastian's arm and pleading with him to reconsider. He told Sebastian that the mountain was angry and would kill anyone who ignored its warnings. Sebastian paused for a moment, acknowledging Lakpa's concern with clinical detachment. He thanked the guide for his dedication, but explained that his responsibility to the team meant he couldn't make decisions based on unverifiable observations. He had analyzed all available data and couldn't find objective support for the warnings. He assured Lakpa that he would monitor conditions constantly and retreat at the first sign of measurable danger. At 7:30 a.m., Sebastian's team was climbing through the lower section of the serac field when the mountain delivered its diagnosis. The massive ice formation that Lakpa had been watching, a serac the size of a city block, collapsed without warning, triggered by the exact conditions the Sherpa had predicted. The collapse created a thunderous roar that echoed across the valley as 5,000 tons of ice began accelerating down the south face. Sebastian had perhaps 5 seconds to react. His medical training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, prioritize immediate threats, take life-saving action. But there were no life-saving actions available in the path of an avalanche moving at 80 miles per hour. For the first time in his career, Sebastian faced a condition that had no treatment. The leading edge of the avalanche struck the team with devastating force. Sebastian was hit by a block of ice the size of a refrigerator that shattered his spine instantly. His vertebrae exploded like glass, severing his spinal cord completely and paralyzing him from the chest down. The impact launched him 200 feet through the air before he crashed into a rock wall with bone-crushing force. His helmet was ripped away by the impact, leaving his skull exposed as he tumbled through the avalanche debris. A second ice block struck his head directly, fracturing his skull in multiple places and causing massive brain hemorrhaging. His left arm was caught between 2 grinding ice chunks and completely severed at the shoulder. The traumatic amputation was instantaneous, spraying blood across the white ice as his severed arteries pumped his life away. As Sebastian cartwheeled through the churning mass of ice and debris, his ribs cracked like twigs under the enormous forces. 12 fractures on his left side, 8 on his right. The broken bones punctured both lungs, causing them to collapse and fill with blood. His pelvis was crushed beyond recognition as he was ground between massive ice blocks, the bone fragments shredding his internal organs. The avalanche carried Sebastian 1,800 feet, down the south face in 90 seconds of pure violence. When it finally came to rest, he was buried under 12 feet of compacted ice debris, his body twisted into an impossible position. But he was still conscious, still alive, experiencing every moment of his destruction with the clinical awareness that had defined his medical career. Initially, the massive trauma triggered his body's natural shock response, flooding his system with adrenaline and endorphins that temporarily suppressed the worst pain, a cruel mercy that allowed him to remain conscious long enough to understand his fate. His severed arm sent phantom signals of agony through his nervous system, while his crushed pelvis created waves of excruciating pain that made coherent thought nearly impossible. The weight of the ice above him made breathing impossible, and the cold began penetrating his body immediately through his torn clothing and exposed wounds. His medical training kicked in automatically, even as shock began setting in. He recognized the clinical signs, his pulse racing, then weakening, the metallic taste of internal bleeding, the cold creeping through his extremities as his blood pressure plummeted. The severed brachial artery was pumping his life away at nearly 2 liters per minute. His punctured lungs were drowning him from the inside, and the massive head trauma was shutting down his vital functions. Paradoxically, the same shock that was killing him temporarily masked the worst of the pain, allowing his clinical mind to catalog each failing system with detached precision. In those final moments of consciousness, every sign that Lakpa had warned about had been present. The ice sounds, the wind shifts, the subtle movements that indicated structural instability. Sebastian's medical training, which demanded objective proof, had blinded him to a form of expertise that couldn't be quantified, but was absolutely real. His clinical skepticism had been the very thing that killed him. Dr. Sebastian Cross died after 4 minutes of consciousness beneath the ice, his medical knowledge providing him with a terrible clarity to understand exactly how quickly he was dying. The trauma surgeon, who had saved hundreds of lives by trusting scientific evidence over intuition, had been killed by his refusal to accept wisdom that couldn't be measured in a laboratory. The search began when Lakpa spotted the avalanche through binoculars and realized Sebastian's team was in its path. He had been watching their progress with growing concern since they departed against his warnings. However, the avalanche had made the entire south face impassable, forcing rescue teams to wait 4 days for conditions to stabilize. When they finally reached the debris field, it took 26 hours of careful excavation to locate the bodies. The recovery team found Sebastian's severed arm 300 feet away from his body, still wearing the medical alert bracelet that identified him as a trauma surgeon. His stethoscope was discovered embedded in the ice nearby, a symbol of the medical expertise that had failed him when he needed it most. Dr. Cross' death on Anapurna proved that some diagnoses cannot be verified through scientific testing, and that ignoring the warnings of those who know the mountains best can turn medical skepticism into a fatal condition. His refusal to accept Lakpa's knowledge cost him his life on a mountain that demands respect for wisdom that cannot be measured by instruments or confirmed through peer review. The goddess of the harvest had claimed another victim who learned too late that some expertise cannot be cross-examined, and that the mountain's final diagnosis is always terminal. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.